Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Cynthia Barnett to discuss The Sound of the Sea, Seashells and the Fate of Oceans, published by our friends at W.W. Norton and Company. I think it would be fitting to note that I am speaking to you on board the Not Today, my boat in the Florida Keys, surrounded by the ocean, and really looking forward to hearing this talk. Cynthia Barnett is the author of 3 previous books, including Rain, longlisted for the National Book Award, and a finalist for the Penn E.O. Wilson Award for Literary Science Writing. She lives with her family in Gainesville, Florida, where she is also the environmental journalist in residence at the University of Florida. To moderate tonight's conversation, we're joined by Jenny Staletovich, who covers science and environment at South Florida Public Radio Station, WLRN, where her beat includes the rising seas and costs of climate change. She previously covered environment, climate change, and hurricanes for the Miami Herald for 5 years and reported for the Palm Beach Post for a decade. She was named one of Audubon Magazine's National Women Greening Journalism and Miami New Times Best Herald Reporter in 2016 for being an informed, impassioned, and steady voice as South Florida charts its future in the face of rising seas. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions, and we already have a bunch already. That's a good sign. By using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of The Sound of the Sea from Books and Books below by pressing the green button or by visiting any one of our stores. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hello. Hello.
Hi there.
Hi. And thank you so much for hosting us, Books and Books. Favorite store. Wish we could be there in person, but maybe next book.
And I am so glad to be part of this too. Thank you, Cynthia. This is, I love this book very much. It's funny because I remember we first met after you published Rain. You gave a speech at a climate conference in Key West. And I think that this book, maybe, weren't you were in Sanibel, you were invited to the Shell Museum there, and I think you were there invited to talk about Rain, right? Or was it one of your other books?
Yes, that's right, Jenny. And first of all, Jenny, thank you so much for being here in conversation with me. It's really neat to be together and talk about the craft with someone who is doing this as well, environmental reporting. Yeah, so the way this book got started is that, well, first of all, as you heard, this is my 4th book. I had written 2 other books about freshwater, and then Rain, of course, all about the atmosphere and the rains. And I was sort of casting about to write a 4th book about the oceans. I like this idea of that I've completed the hydrologic cycle now, and I have. There's something that feels really nice about that. So I was sort of looking for that book, and I was invited to the Bailey Matthews National Seashell Museum on Sanibel to give a talk. And I was speaking with the director about a survey they had done of visitors to find out how much visitors already knew about seashells. And this was about 10 years before my visit, but the surveys revealed that about 90% of visitors, and many of these were like tourist families with their children visiting Florida, 90% did not know that a seashell was made by a living animal. Many people thought they were rocks or stones. And I was so shocked disturbed, sort of couldn't stop thinking about that. And it really, I thought it really said something. It's like a metaphor for the way we see the oceans themselves. So just like we've loved seashells for the beautiful exterior, but we don't know the life inside, we've loved the oceans as this beautiful backdrop of life without knowing what's really happening beneath the waves. I mean, I think
we don't see beneath them at all.
Yeah.
We're on them on top of our boats and everything else. And I confess to you that as a kid, I had gone over to Sanibel, and you talk about this in your book, the people who load up on these shells. I mean, this was back when, it was legal to collect shells. We had no idea that, I didn't think they were rocks, but I also didn't know that they were full of live creatures. So by the time we got home to Fort Lauderdale with our buckets of shells, the trunk of the car smelled so bad. I mean, and now I feel terrible about that, but I still have the pot of shells, the fighting conchs. That used to be so plentiful on Sanibel. I was just there this past weekend and I didn't see any.
You were in Sanibel last weekend. Wow.
Yes.
Well, I'll tell you a funny thing about seashells that I've learned. And I should say I was not a shell collector. I loved picking up shells as a kid, but I'm not like a hardcore collector of anything except maybe books. But
I have to admit I went through a phase.
A funny thing I've learned about shells and the animals that make them, the marine mollusks, and this is very true at Sanibel because I spent a lot of time at Sanibel for this book. They are there at different times, and the shells are there at different times. So sometimes you'll go to Sanibel and the beaches will be covered with live Florida fighting conchs, and it's so much fun. I love the way they walk, and I describe them as doing their Tai Chi moves, because they just have these great moves. Sometimes you'll go and it's all starfish. One time I actually went to film the book trailer with a student at the journalism college where I teach. And I felt badly for him because that day, the only thing on the beach were these really big, giant cockles and no other shell. It was like a giant cockle orgy. So it could be that the Florida fighting conchs were just not around that day, Jenny. But the funny thing you said about car trunks, I'll just quickly tell you this. This was an old joke in the 1950s in Florida. They used to say that the best place to find seashells was at the Georgia border because that's when families' car trunks started to stink, and they would literally dump all their shells on the side of the road.
I can still smell that. It is the worst.
It is really bad.
So tell me, so you, as a kid, you said that you and your dad used to dive for conchs and
yeah. So this actually isn't in the book, but those of you who might have read The Wilder Heart of Florida, which is a recent nature writing anthology compiled by University Press of Florida and edited by Jack Davis and Leslie Poole, I wrote a little bit more intimately in that book an essay about Sanibel from my childhood, where my father and I used to go island hopping, and we used to in the Keys, in Sanibel, and he lived in Tampa, so all the islands around Tampa off the Gulf Coast, we would collect buckets and buckets of conchs, and he would make conch chowder, and he taught me how to spearfish in the Keys. So
were they queen conchs, the
big queen conchs back then, as well as the little Florida fighting conchs. And I remember a day when we just collected these buckets of Florida fighting conchs, and we made chowder. And I remember him digging out their little bodies with his pocket knife. And it bothers me now to think about that, and to think about, just what that abundance that I remember from childhood, and being kind of, our family cared about the land and the sea and creatures, but we just had this sense of great abundance, that these creatures were always going to be there. So I grew up fishing and eating shellfish and other mollusks. And even when my kids were little, we gathered, I've raised them, you know, scalloping in the Gulf of Mexico. I devote a chapter to the bay scallop. So in this book, I've tried to be really honest as, you know, just a person, just like my readers. I'm just a person trying to figure this out and trying to live better and try to figure out, you know, how to live, how to eat, how we might change. And even the way I eat seafood changed over the course of reporting this book. And
I have to say, after I finished the book, I
think we are all changing. I think we are all changing how we eat and how we live, and that this is a process that we're going through together.
Right. Well, so tell me, for the book, you started with shells, but then you had to make a story of the shells. And reading the book, there were so many things that I learned that I had no idea. I was so glad that you went to the beginning. But when you were thinking of structuring it, when you were thinking of telling the story, you know, you had to make some really hard choices, I'm sure, but how did you come up with the idea to, you know, because you linked it all together. And as a reader, I think that's so valuable that often I'm just reading about an environmental issue, you know, or a financial issue. And this, you managed to weave it all together.
Oh, thank you, Jenny. I hope so. I'm glad you felt that way after reading it, because it does feel so vast. I think that some of our students from the journalism college are on the call, and I'm glad for them to hear this, because there were so many false starts, and everyone has false starts. And even when you're 55 years old and you've written 4 books, you still have false starts and lose your confidence and, you know, tear things up and throw them in the garbage. So at first, Jenny, for like months and months, I thought I should start with marble. I got really enamored with the idea that, you know, all of this marine life over all of eternity made the limestone underfoot, the marble in the mountaintops. And I got it in my mind that I was going to open with Michelangelo. And I was actually trying to tie a statue by Michelangelo to this book and bring it all together. And it was a disaster. And I couldn't stop writing that bad idea. And I wrote the whole thing, and it took me months. And I was just convinced that it was a great idea. And it took like really writing through it to realize what a bad idea it was. It was overwrought because I was so stressed about trying to organize all of this that I overdid it. And only when I stepped back and wrote about my daughter, actually, when I opened with a bit of a simpler beginning, just thinking about my daughter collecting shells when she was 5 and connecting her to a Neanderthal person who archaeologists know they collected shells for beauty and aesthetic purposes beyond food. It was only when I made that really, you know, kind of maternal human connection that it worked. So what I did, the way I organized it in my mind, so in a seashell, this is a Florida fighting conch. This part of the shell is called the apex. It's where the animal, it's the oldest part of the shell. It was where the animal was when it was first born. So this part of the shell was there when the animal was born, the very, very tip, and then the animal winds the shell around and around over a lifetime and adds to the edges. So the way I ultimately thought about the book after I made all of those false starts with Michelangelo and the Italian Alps, I finally got over the Italian Alps, and I thought of the apex of my book was Florida. That's where I come from. That's my place, and that feels comfortable to me. Further, I'm from Southwest Florida, the same county as Sanibel, although we weren't not from Sanibel, but I was born in the same county. So I thought of Sanibel as the apex. And then I wound around the world to tell the story, but I always came back home. And that finally allowed my brain to organize something so big and vast that it, went all the way to West Africa and back around. But thinking about that apex is what finally got me organized. And then I further organized the chapters around iconic seashells that had been important in human history. So at first I was trying to write about shellfish, oysters, clams, everything. And there came a point when I had to decide, you just need to come up with really iconic shells from human history and stick to those. Other people have written beautiful and whole books about, people have written books about oysters. My friend David Berger wrote an entire book about razor clams. Those books had been written, so I thought it would be good to just choose 12 seashells and stick to those, because as you know, that allowed me to tell a huge story, even through 12 shells. Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting because the 12 shells you selected were like so critical, and the people that were connected to them made the story just so much more compelling. Like some of the scientists, alive and dead, I mean, they were really fascinating. And covering the environment, I talked to a lot of scientists, and I've always said they're like detectives, on the beat. Like they have some of the best stories and just the best information. But so who are some of the ones that stood out? And also I asked too many questions at once.
There were a lot of I do the same thing.
I'm sorry. But there's the scientists, but then there's also a lot of women scientists who were in your book who, especially in history, got overlooked. And so I was really happy to hear some of those stories about some of Julia Ellen Rogers. Is that?
Yeah, so I'd love to talk about Julia Ellen Rogers for a moment. I don't think anyone has asked me about her yet.
Leave it to me.
Yeah, great. So Julia Ellen Rogers is this fascinating figure who she's actually, she is influential in the progressive era, like around the 1890s. There's a fascinating movement in the United States called the Nature Studies Movement. And this is not anything I knew anything about. In fact, when you read like Last Child in the Woods, this is a huge issue that we're all concerned about, but I never knew the history went back this far. So in the 1890s, there was a group of really progressive educators and scientists who were convinced that to understand science and the world around them, children should not just be taught from textbooks, but should have hands-on nature study in the public schools. So they should, have snails in the classroom. If they're near the coast, go out to the beach, have a class garden, watch bird eggs hatch, all of those things that we now know how important all of those things are. There's a huge movement in the progressive era. Julia Ellen Rogers, who was originally from Iowa, is part of this movement. And in fact, she wrote all the curriculum for nature studies for the Iowa public schools. And she ends up at Cornell and becomes a nature writer. And she wrote books about trees. She wrote a very at its time, famous book about seashells called The Shell Book. And her Shell Book was published in 1908, and it was hugely popular, like the most popular seashell book for the whole.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Set the stage a little bit too, because that was in the shell craze. I mean, that's the other part we haven't.
Yeah, it was earlier. Yeah, it was earlier than the shell craze. That's the other interesting thing about it. She really preceded the shell craze. So she was a fascinating figure who wrote a lot about shells, and she was in this important movement. And I can't tell the whole story right now, but it was a really insidious story that she and other women were literally written out of the history of the Cornell academic history of this movement, but also scientists, male scientists around World War I just decided that nature studies was too feminine or too light, and that children did not need to be out in nature. They needed to study textbooks, and they needed to study science books written by men. And it was just, it's a devastating story. It's a story I didn't know anything about, and I really uncovered a lot about her, and I hope am bringing her back to life. So when she set out to do her shell book, she came down to Sanibel at an amazing time, you know, the very early years of the 20th century, when it was just covered with parades of mollusks. And she was on this houseboat with another nature writer named Anthony Dimmick. And it's a terrific story. Yeah, it's a terrific story, but with a really sad ending. And something poignant about it that I want to point out is that you can kind of feel what might have been when you realize some of the children who went through that there was a brief time when nature study was a part of America's public schools. Two people who were educated in nature study at school were Aldo Leopold and Rachel Carson. And they, in fact, Leopold very likely used the nature study material that Julia Ellen Rogers had developed for the Iowa public schools. So it's just it's so poignant to understand what they knew and what was lost, and how much of that was as a result of misogyny. So that I tell that story, and she ends up in California, and she ends up helping to bring nature study to the California public schools, which remains strong to this day. But you can't help but wonder what might have been, and whether we would be in this situation where so many children don't know that a seashell is made by a living animal.
Right. I mean, we both have kids, and I can't imagine my kids' classrooms not ever having an aquarium in it. I mean, there was always somebody had something live in the classroom.
Right.
Somebody had to take care of it. Or
that's right. That's right. We often got stuck taking care of the hamsters on the long weekends and so on. But yeah, I mean, teachers really know, and teachers try so hard to do these things. And we have put so many constraints on classroom teachers to, teach to the test and so on. You can really see the impact that this is having.
Right. Well, so another part of the book, you went to the Maldives and you decided to take your son, Will, who was he a teenager at the time? And reading how you arrived in the middle of monsoon season and the storm that you stepped into, having my own kids, I was like, wow. So why, I mean, it was important clearly for you to take him. And I wondered what went into the decision and just about that experience being around the world, in the middle of a monsoon with your kid.
Yeah. So another funny thing about that storm I was in, for anyone who has read my rain book, you know that I went to the rainiest place on earth, which was Cherrapunji, India, in the middle of monsoon season, and it did not rain. And that was like, I have never planned anything so intensely to make sure I would be at the right place in the right time. And then it didn't rain, and it kind of made for a beautiful ending to the book, because I was able to talk about the climate changes and so on. So ironically, I take my son Will to the Maldives, and we end up in this extraordinary monsoon, in the time when I was hoping we would be able to be out on the sea and be out on the reefs. And so that part was wild. But the reason I went to the Maldives was to follow the very, unlikely story of the first global money. So the first global money was not cryptocurrency. it was money cowries, and these were tiny white gleaming seashells that served as money longer than any paper or coin money in history. They traded around the world for 1,000 years, and they were all harvested in the Maldives. And a really poignant part of the story is that money cowries were used to purchase perhaps a third of the enslaved Africans forced to the Americas. So as I write about seashells around the world, I keep bringing in the human story. And what happens by the end of the book, really what happens is that I set out to listen to seashells, to see what seashells have to tell us about what's happening to the earth and its life, what's happening to the environment. But they actually had more to say about people. And that was, that was so true from the Taino native people of the Caribbean and their Queen Conch history, to the Native American history, to the, the story of money cowries and slavery. All of these extraordinary stories of justice and injustice come up in this book. And I think part of that was the time that I was writing. Now I was writing during Black Lives Matter. All of this had come up in my reporting, and I just decided to really hit it hard and bring it in. And I'm very glad that I did. I think maybe too often at least in my own work over the years, too often I think my water stories were missing that justice element and human element. So, it was past time to give greater voice to some of those stories. And then honestly, Jenny, the reason I brought Will is because he bugged the hell out of me to bring him. He really, my son loves to travel. He just wants to see the world. He loves people. He loves the world, and he wants to see what it's all about. He had especially always wanted to go to Africa. So when he found out I was taking this crazy trip, I went from the Maldives to India to West Africa. He begged me to see if he could come with me, and I agreed to let him come. And he was a great traveling partner. And often when you have a kid with you on a reporting trip, and I've brought him on some book events too, and my daughter as well, often if you have a kid with you, it opens the door to another culture, because everyone relates to their kids both being along. So like our host in the Maldives felt comfortable dragging his son everywhere because I had my son. And like when you go around and meet people and meet families in other parts of the world, they love, in my experience, they really love meeting kids. So he was a great part of the story. And we, personally, it was personally profound for us as a mother and son who come from a Southern family to end up in West Africa in some of the slave castles on the Ghanaian coast. And this is a coast also, the Maldives, where the cowrie money came from, and the West African coast, where many of them ended up, are two of the most threatened places in the world due to the rising sea. And to me, that was a symbolic, message of some sort about capitalism. Really, it became a way for me to explore those themes by looking at the rising seas in both places. So it was profound for us to be there, and I ended up being very glad that I took the trip with him, and that he has seen some of the things that he has seen and heard those stories. I wish that all teenagers could hear some of the stories that we heard, both about climate change in the Maldives and about the slave history of West Africa.
And that you bring up climate change, and I haven't asked you specifically about that, and the story of the cowrie and how it was used to buy enslaved people, and climate change. I just feel like those two things are like hugely important and related, because it shows that, this is going to sound kind of stupid, but that shells bring out the worst in us and hopefully the best. But you know, talk about, you know, there's a whole shell oil story too that you tell.
Oh
about.
yeah.
Shell
oh
oil.
my gosh.
Again, the shells like seem to bring out the worst in us, but
yeah, it's true. Shells represent the world, and they do, right? Because they are a home. They're a home for an animal called the mollusks. But they also represent our home in representing the earth itself. So it is, you know, it was definitely a conclusion of mine that shells show us at our worst, yes, especially when they became money, but they also show our extraordinary innovation. And, you know, by the end, as you know, I'm traveling with scientists, many times women scientists who are working on alternative energy, inspired by giant clams, which is a crazy story. And I do get to the innovation and the great part of humanity. And I do have a lot of faith in humanity and hope that comes across in the book, even though it has its dark parts. But to briefly tell you where climate change and shells really fit in intimately, essentially the marine mollusks build their shells using the process called biomineralization. They are taking up minerals from the surrounding seawater to build their shells, primarily calcium carbonate. So the oceans, because of climate change and carbon emissions, the oceans have become 30% more acidic than at the start of the Industrial Revolution. And they are also, so they've absorbed about 30% of the additional carbon emissions, making them that much more acidic. And that is having an impact on the absorption of carbonate for the mollusks. So some of them are struggling to build shells in the acidifying sea. Scientists started noticing this with pteropods, which are teeny tiny sea butterflies with very thin shells. So they were kind of the first to show this, but now these impacts are being seen in other shell-making animals, including some of the really important shellfish like mussels and clams that are being raised for food. The other big thing that's happening to the oceans, of course, is that they're growing warmer. The oceans have actually absorbed 90% of the additional heat. And you know, if you just think about all the heat dome in the Pacific Northwest 2 weeks ago, and the fact that hundreds of people died, just imagine how warm our Earth would be if the oceans hadn't absorbed 90% of the extra heat already. Like, the oceans are really protecting us from climate change in a profound way. But anyway, some mollusks also, the oceans are becoming too warm for some mollusks. So that, you know, it's the double whammy of acidification and warming.
And some of the scientists are finding ways that they're evolving too, though. So, right, that was,
yeah.
I thought that was a really cool thing that you wrote about, was that the evolution, you know, like that shells can lead the way.
Yeah, I mean, that's the beautiful thing about these animals. They're, as someone mentioned in the Ask a Question, these animals have been evolving for 500 million years, and that means they have lived through 5 previous mass extinctions and acidification and much warmer seas. And so they're incredible survivors. I would say it's more of a story of survival than for the devastation we're seeing with many animals on land. But yes, scientists see that some mollusks are beginning to adapt to the acidifying sea, some in just a few generations. So that's, and all of that is changing really quickly, and still a degree of uncertainty, but it is pretty interesting to know that these creatures can adapt.
So you mentioned the chat box. I'm sorry, are people asking questions? Because I feel like if there
no,
are questions,
I just saw one earlier. Jenny, I'll read you a funny one from Curtis Morgan. He says, will the moderator display her skill at sounding the conch horn?
Oh, I'm gonna kill him. So actually he has a conch horn too.
Oh. Jenny, is your conch horn there in your office? Is it behind you? Can you pull it out?
I've got the conch horn.
Curtis.
I'll step away for a second.
Thank you very much, Curtis. I had no idea. So everyone else on the Zoom, Curtis Morgan was a long time great environmental reporter at the Miami Herald, and then the environmental editor, and I think Jenny's environmental editor when she was there. Is that right, Jenny? Yes. And now he's a wonderful editor, and I'm so glad that he has told us this tidbit that I didn't know. So let's hear it.
I'm sure he's getting great joy from this. I have not played it in a while. So let's see if I can do this. It's not pretty to watch, so you can look away.
Our eyes are glued.
Here we go. Here it is. It's just got the top cut off. And here we go. Actually, that was
excellent.
Warmed up before that.
I love it. I love it. And that was a Queen Conch horn. And you can hear that every night at sunset on Mallory Square still today, even though there aren't many conchs to speak of in the Keys, you can still hear the conch trumpet. And I mean, the trumpet story is wonderful. I write about conch trumpets, you know, in really early times, and a particularly fascinating story from Peru, where they were quite iconic in temples of the Chavin culture. And the conch trumpets are just an amazing story to me, and I love it that they're still blown.
And I'm hoping that I can return the favor to Curtis one day and make him play his corn in front of a bunch of strangers.
Yes. So I'll get to a couple. Okay, I think that I answered Jean Rosenberg's question just now on the CO2 and the acidification. Someone, oh, Steve Levine is on the call. Hi, Steve. I've just read a wonderful book of Steve's on America's bilingual century. He says, from reading your book, I was so surprised by how our planet's surface is plastered with ancient shells, and that they are the basic ingredients of so much of our material world. Did that surprise you too? Steve, that's an interesting question, because I will tell you that as a reporter who covered water for so long, I've always been really aware of the limestone underfoot in Florida. And you might remember this line, and I remember writing it. Like all these years, I think when I'm walking around Florida, my brain is thinking about the limestone underfoot, and that it's holding our water, and that it's made of shell. So yeah, I did always think about that. And I remember that line, I think it's in the first chapter, where I say, many of us walked our children to kindergarten on shells. The shells were in the sidewalk, because the limestone is used to make concrete, and then the shells were underneath in the strata, and the shells were making the limestone aquifer. So I do think about that so much, and I love thinking about the fact that shells make the world. I learned a lot more about that, and how how they make the white cliffs of Dover and so much of our beautiful world. And I think that's really a neat thing about them. Let's see who else has a Jean Rosenberg asked, what is the conservation status of giant clams in the genus Tridacna? And the answer is that the giant of the giant clams, which are Tridacna gigas, are imperiled because of overharvesting, both for their shells and for their adductor muscle, which is used as a sashimi delicacy. And so I saw many other giant clams in the tropics that are doing better. I think there are like 10 different kinds of giant clams, and some of them are doing better than others, but those, you know, really proverbial giant clams, gigas, which are so big, which are sitting there so vulnerable on the ocean floor, they are definitely imperiled. So I devoted a chapter to the giant clams, and I traveled to Palau, and that was a neat trip because I got to write a lot about the cultural importance of clams to many people around the world. And I wrote about the imperiled nature of clams, but at the same time, as I mentioned, there are really some hopeful stories involving the clams, both in terms of their little bioreactors. They're bioreactors in that they're feeding off algae and sunlight. And the scientist I was with was researching applications for algal biofuels. And the other promising thing that was the extent of giant clam aquaculture that's going on all over the Pacific. Different countries are growing giant clams in big farms and then putting them out in the sea. And so some of these aquaculture operations can hopefully help take a little pressure off the wild animals.
And in Palau, didn't you, I remember you wrote about when you travel there, you have to sign a promise. Oh. I thought, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
I need to tell people what it is because they may not know what it is.
I wish I had my passport with me so I could read you this. I could read you this bit. I think I can search for it quickly, and let me see if I can find it here. Passport. Yes, I'm going to read you the pledge that Palau stamps into passport. So when you come into immigration, an immigration officer stamps this in your passport and watches you sign it. And it's a promise to the island's children. Children of Palau, I take this pledge as your guest to preserve and protect your beautiful and unique island home. I vow to tread lightly, act kindly, and explore mindfully. I shall not take what is not given. I shall not harm what does not harm me. The only footprints I shall leave are those that will wash away. So, so obviously that's part public relations, right? But I have to tell you that it is pretty moving to come through immigration and have to sign that and have a person in a uniform watching you sign it. You also pay, I think it's a $50 fee right when you come into Palau to enjoy the nature of Palau, and all that money is plowed back into conservation. So all of these efforts to help people understand what's happening to the earth and its life, which is essentially what Jenny and I do for a living, and some of the people on the call do for a living. This stuff is really important. And, this is something I talk to our students about. There's a place for you in this, and everyone kind of has the thing they're good at that can help us get there. So Jenny has found her niche in the radio. I've found my niche in book writing. That marketing effort in Palau, there's something really brilliant about that every single tourist is going to sign that pledge, and it's pretty moving. And so I think, these efforts are also important.
And there's a level of seriousness to it. It's not just a sign on a tourist board, like you said. It's an official document, and it's it's sort of a pledge. So it just kind of hammers home how seriously they take it.
Yes.
So as a visitor, you should take it seriously too.
Yeah, exactly.
I wanted to also ask you about, before we get away from Queen Conch, and I don't want to blow my horn again. But one thing I did not realize that was going on in Florida was how much effort there was to revive the Queen Conch, and then that Irma set back those efforts many, many years. When I saw that Irma came through and really just buried a lot of conchs, I was surprised. I was like, oh, I missed that story. Why? I should have done that story at the time.
That story was from the fish and wildlife scientists who I interviewed in the Keys. I'm trying to find everyone. This is what the author's copy looks like. You see, I can't remember everything I wrote, so I have a few Post-it notes and a few. I used a pink highlighter, given the nature of the Queen Conch chapter. But I was just going to read you a bit about hurricanes and Queen Conchs, because I too was amazed about Queen Conchs and what happened. Amid the human crises, we did, and I'm talking about Hurricane Irma specifically before this, but amid the human crises, we don't often consider what happens to marine animals as hurricanes pass over the sea. Their triumph and turmoil are unseen by satellites and storm chasers. Fishes, including sharks and snook, can read signs, including the drop in barometric pressure that precedes big storms. Some will evacuate dangerous conditions. With their carbonate strength and rough textures, oyster and coral reefs are known for their ability to withstand storm surges and disperse wave energy. They can perform better than human-made bulkheads at protecting life and property in hurricanes. And I know that's very important to you all in South Florida, and especially with the debates going on about how to make Biscayne Bay more resilient. Those oysters can be really important. Yet the next set of animals, those that inhabit the reefs, can take a beating. When Hurricane Hugo hit the US Virgin Islands in 1989, its 25-foot waves and 200-mile-an-hour winds lashed Buck Island Reef National Monument for 14 hours straight, destroying part of the enormous southern reef and flinging the surviving section 90 feet landward. For more than a decade following the hurricane, park employees could hear the displaced reef groan and creak like a lost soul. It finally quieted down, recalcified, and reattached to its new sea bottom, not something a human seawall will do. Gastropods and bivalves that live in the sand or in seagrass that can be ripped from their roots and hurled to shore in hurricanes have a more harrowing time. Mollusks and the urchins, starfish, and other creatures thrown together with them can be picked up by currents, winds, and breaking waves and tossed to the tops of dunes or rocks when they become stranded. It's at least as common for mollusks and other slow-moving marine animals to be buried alive by tons of sand that shift in hurricanes. When the Florida Keys scientists surveyed the still sparse conch herd after Hurricane Georges passed over in 1998, the queens had been entombed in a bank of sand. Delgado, that's Gabe Delgado with Fish and Wildlife in the Keys. Delgado described seeing only a few sets of conch eyes wiggling from the tips of their tightly buried shells. He and his colleague dug up all the shells they could find, freeing 100 or so queens. And then after that, as Jenny says, Hurricane Irma comes, and has a huge impact. I think they had counted 600,000 conchs across the Keys before Irma, and that had been a record since they banned conch fishing. And then after the hurricane, the numbers dropped to around 300,000. So that was an enormous impact on the queen conch population. And I think what it underscores, and this comes up throughout the book, it's never just one thing, right? It's not just our over harvesting. It's not just climate change. It's not just warming. It's over harvesting and warming and acidification and how we've altered the coastlines, how we dredged up seagrass to build ports and marinas. It is, the way we live has had this really multiple impact on marine species. And so there's not one solution either. I think that's the point, is that it was a real myriad of harm that got us to where we are, and it will take a myriad of solutions and a different way of living too, I think, to get us out of some of the situations we're in.
I mean, and that's reading just about the conchs that struck me is it's like pulling threads. You take one thing out, and then there's just a cascading effect. The role of the shells in the ocean, the role of sea urchins, sponges, all these things they work together. And when we start chipping away at them, we're just eroding the system.
It's a great point. And something that really sticks with me after writing this book is the importance of seagrass. Like, we hear so much about coral reefs, and coral reefs is the big habitat that we always write about, always hear about, we're all trying to save. And really, seagrass is as important a habitat. We've torn out so much seagrass to build things. Now we are hearing about the role of seagrass losses in these manatee deaths. The loss of seagrass has an impact on these conch herds. The conchs need to herd in seagrass, and they
also eat the algae, right?
They eat the algae that's living on seagrass. So seagrass is just a huge part of the equation in Florida and around the world. And the great thing about seagrass, if we could restore seagrasses worldwide, the people who do carbon analysis have shown that those seagrasses can absorb as much carbon as the great rainforests of the world. And so that is really important. It's a really important thing to focus on, both here in Florida and elsewhere.
And they also play a big role in hurricanes, because if you have a healthy flat with seagrass that's holding down the sediment, you've got a bank. That's another thing to block waves, really, and it's waves when they roll in.
Really good point. Yes.
So I know down here I've written a lot. I know a lot of people have written a lot about seagrass, and especially around Biscayne Bay and Florida Bay, and the efforts to save those meadows, and just how much has been lost. I agree. Like we hear a lot about reefs now because of stony coral disease. Suddenly we have this outbreak that's drawing, it's urgent. So it's drawing a lot of attention, as it deserves, but we shouldn't overlook the other things like seagrass meadows that are just also beautiful. I think they're as beautiful to look at as reefs sometimes. Maybe it's just a different eye of the beholder, but
so beautiful.
I don't think there's anything we can overlook, honestly.
Right.
And I think we just need to keep honing in on that point that we're all connected. And, one thing happens here and you think it's happening, alone, and it's not. It's affecting everything else in nature. So I hope we can get there. I mean, I think that it's so important to have books like this, to illuminate all of those things and continue thinking about them and having these conversations and, just enlightening people about it and maybe getting them involved in making some changes. But anyway, I choose to hope. It's been amazing. What a great conversation. I learned so much listening, and I think that probably our viewers have too. So just want to thank you both. And I want to remind everyone watching that you can order your copy of the book right here from Books and Books, and we will ship it right off to you, that you can come into any of our stores, and we have it there too. And just to thank you for joining us tonight, and I hope you will continue to do so. And thank you both for being with us here in our virtual bookstore.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the audience and for the great questions, and for those who were here and didn't ask a question, we appreciate you too. And Jenny, for blowing your conch horn. That was greater than I ever expected. I did not expect to hear Jenny Staletovich blow a conch horn tonight, and it really made my night.
I really think we need an encore. to close. Come on.
One more time. One more time. It'll be like the sunset.
Close with a
Cynthia,
bang.
this is for you. I'm not sure many more people I would do this for. So let me see if I can do better than the last time.
Take a deep breath.
I know, ready?
Wow.
Okay, I am very impressed.
Fantastic. Thank you,
impressed.
Jenny. Love it.
Yay. Okay, well, good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Thanks again.
Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye.